This from a Labor source right now speaking to 6 News, and I quote, "This is an absolute disgrace. What the fuck has happened? Intervention is desperately needed."
Good. It's a good reminder that the Labor Party in Tasmania was in administration until just before the election. Literally had the federal Labor Party running things in Tasmania because you couldn't run yourselves.
I mean, at the end of the day, you've got a situation here where there's a swing against the government and it's not going to the Labor Party. And that is not good news for the Labor Party. I mean, if you're in opposition, there's a feeling of discontent about a government and you're not getting the swing. It's looking like a very disappointing night for the Labor Party in Tasmania.
The difference is the Liberal vote is down 14%. And the vote for others is up 14%. So there's been a huge shift from government to the crossbench.
There should be an its time factor happening. The question for Rebecca White is, why isn't she cutting through? Why hasn't she been able to really capitalise on what should be an its time factor that doesn't seem to be there as heavily in this election?
If the government's so bad, why isn't Labor a shoe-in tonight?
Well, that's a fair question, and I go back to what I said again, people are just sick of the duopoly. Look, I do think there'll be questions asked about Rebecca White. That's like 3 election defeats in a row. Labor sort of mired under 30% of the vote.
In 2014, Labor was tossed out of office. Tonight, the Labor vote is 1% higher than at that election. The Green vote is 0.5% higher. So the Labor and the Greens have done no better than 2014.
Ever since Bob Brown departed the elected ranks of the Greens, they've been on a downhill run. Yeah, they did well in 2010 with 5 Greens elected, 1 in each electorate. Partly, as we've discussed already, that came down to the high profile of some of their candidates, not necessarily because of their policies, and an anti-government sentiment, anti-major party sentiment as well. But since then, I think the current incumbents in the Tasmanian Parliament, being Vicar Bailey, formerly of the Wilderness Society, and Rosalie Woodruff, are just not effective communicators. There's one other element too, though. They don't actually talk about the issues generally that matter. Yeah, federally, they're talking about housing affordability, but in terms of power price pressures and cost of living, they are nowhere to be seen. And so those people who have traditionally voted for them aren't like everyone else. They have budgets to meet and costs to cover. The Greens don't cater for them as well.
And I think people are looking beyond the Greens to minority groups or independents. I just don't think they're good communicators. Still too many of them.
So if you've got 2 Greens in Clark, 2 in Franklin, and 1 in Bass and 1 in Lyons, I think, Tabitha Badger in Lyons.
Yeah, 1 in Lyons, that's what I got here,
Yeah, then that is a possibility. That would be the stuff of nightmares.
It is fascinating to see over several elections now when the vote's been pulled away from the major parties, it hasn't been going to the Greens.
What I think the Labor Party has to do if it bears out at the end of the evening that, as we predict, that there's a swing against the government but it hasn't come to us, then the Labor Party needs to look at how we've performed, what else we need to do, and there'll be some soul-searching to be done, because I think Rebecca White's been a strong leader, but obviously not cutting through and the votes aren't coming to us. So, of course, there's a disappointment. But
this is a 3rd election loss for Rebecca, and I know that she would feel that deeply, but someone needs to take responsibility inside the Labor Party for some decisions they've made over the last few years, and they need to start to really have a think about how they're going to be a credible party for the Tasmanian community.
Is it time that the Labor Party and the Liberal Party start using the phrase minority government with maturity and not like it's electoral kryptonite?
And, you know, you look at these proportional systems like the Hare-Clark one that we've spent a lot of time talking about tonight, in places like Germany, places like New Zealand, very rarely do you get majorities. Very rarely does anyone get a majority. They've got to cobble together all sorts to try and get the numbers to have confidence in their various parliaments.
One of the things that is exciting about tonight is we will be left with a parliament that looks very different to the types of parliaments we've had in the past. I don't know that we'll ever go back to majority governments like we've seen in the past. So we do, as major parties, we do need to take that role seriously and treat that responsibility with the reverence that it deserves and look at how those parliaments can operate in a way that deliver good outcomes for Tasmanians.
But what we clearly are hearing from the community tonight is that they want a far more collaborative parliament. So I'd be very keen to talk to all parties, including Labor and the Greens, about how we can make this parliament function in the interest of Tasmania and not in the interest of political parties.
But we will respect the will of Tasmania, and we will work with whoever is elected in the parliament to get through a Labor legislative agenda, to get our policies through.
Then Rebecca White would have to cobble together another 4 to somehow form a government, and that, with respect, would genuinely be a coalition of chaos.
You'd have the Greens there, who would demand an end to native forestry, which apparently the Labor Party in Tasmania supports, to ban salmon farming in Tasmania, which apparently the Labor Party supports. It would kill the stadium as well. There'd be a range of things they would demand. And Helen, we know that's what they do. Michael Field, the Premier who governed with less seats and less popular vote, did a deal with the Greens, and he said it was like playing poker with a group of people that never show you their cards.
The Liberals have
and
been
this is what they do.
Labor's not going to form government with 11 seats. They're just not. I mean, the only way they could do is to get all the Greens on side, and they've point-blank ruled out governing with the Greens. They're not going to do it. It would be in Labor's interests to leave the Liberal Party to try and govern. We've seen that. We saw this in after the 89-92 Parliament, after 96-98, and after 2010-2014. And we know this from around the country. If a government falls into minority, it's very difficult for them to recover.
Would Labor really walk away from governing if it means a deal with the Greens after being in opposition for 10 years?
And Rebecca White having 3 cracks.
Can you really walk away from government just to live up to that no deal promise that she's made?
Well, we wouldn't be going into any coalition. It's now against our party rules.
It may be Jeremy Rockcliffe who has his own coalition of chaos, and he's the one that coined that term, and indeed that's why we're in this position and having this election.
If he couldn't manage 2 defecting Liberals to run the state, how's he going to do that with the Jackie Lambie network and other independents?
A lot better than Beck White from 10 seats, I suspect.
Well, we'll wait and see, will we, how he does, and how long it will be before we're back at the polls again.
But he also said that the second clear takeaway from this election result was that Tasmanians have delivered a clear message. Interestingly, he did not spell out exactly what that message is, but he said that the Liberal government and he, as Premier, has heard that message and will act upon it. He highlighted that it's a very poor result for the Labor Party, the lowest primary vote ever for the Labor Party. Interestingly, he also said that he congratulated his candidates and called them the team of the decade. It's also the worst result for the Liberal Party in the past decade as well.
Jeremy Rockcliffe's, frankly, pretty graceless and delusional, I thought his speech was. I mean, he's come in with a 10% plus swing against him and basically claimed victory.
I'm a bit bewildered by that speech from Jeremy Rockcliffe. I feel like he's been watching a different election count than we have been. There was no mention of a massive swing away from the Liberal Party, no mention of the fact that for him to govern in the way that he's described, he'll be governing in minority, the very kind of minority that he called this election to avoid. There was no acknowledgement of that at all, and I just find that a really strange, quite bizarre speech from him.
He called this election to get a majority government.
That was our hope.
The instability of having a minority government, and all he's achieved after sending the Tasmanians to the poll is to most likely go into a minority
And we'll probably
government.
have a new Labor leader
What a
after
waste
that,
of money.
I suspect.
Is he the chap, though, if that's what plays out here tonight, and given the way that he's been very critical about independence and minority government, is he really the man to lead those sorts of negotiations, given he's rubbished it?
A lot of those candidates are pretty left-leaning. I mean, there's probably 9 to 11 seats to share out between independents, Jackie Lambie and the Greens.
There aren't that many allies that you look at the numbers and the parties, the crossbench, that you look and say that's a clear ally for the Liberals. If the best we can say is David O'Byrne, a former Labor MP.
A lot of the independents who seem more likely to get up than not seem to have more left-leaning policies. Plus, you throw in the Jackie Lambie wildcard factor too. She's been at war with Jeremy Rockcliffe over the past week. The Liberals, I think, have done major own goals in terms of their relationship with the Jackie Lambie network.
That the Jackie Lambie network basically bragged about the fact that they had no policies to offer the people of Tasmania.
You know, I don't agree with Eric on much, but I will agree with him on one thing. When the bells stop ringing on day one, when there is either a confidence vote or a no confidence vote in the government, Jackie Lambie candidates, like everyone else, are going to have to walk to one side or the other and put their backsides down on the seats. It's an abrogation of your democratic responsibility to do anything else. So
A theme emerging here for me is that with the swing against the government and a swing against the other major party, the Labor Party, people are... It seems to me there's a significant protest vote here.
People are ticked off.
And I think it does come down to that. We're annoyed at both the major parties. Where do we go? Well, we know Lambie and we'll go with her crew.
The vote hasn't shifted from Liberal to Labor, but to a halfway house in the Jackie Lambie network, where there is a sense of this is a bit of a protest vote, but people don't really know what they're voting for.
But we've also got to remember, Jackie Lambie's not going to be sitting in the state parliament. She's a senator, so she's going to be in Canberra doing her job there. So it's going to be very interesting to see in what direction they ultimately go, depending on the final makeup of the Lambie candidates.
Well, speaking of which, what can you tell us, if anything, about her candidates there?
I know nothing. No one really knows very much about them. And when you talk to people, they talk about, oh, I want to vote for Jackie. But they're not actually getting that well, they didn't get that opportunity tonight. So it'll be interesting to see how they perform.
What we have to keep in mind is that 2/3 of Tasmanians have voted for the two major parties. So to say that this is the death knell for them is...
it sounds like you're in denial about the vote.
Yeah. When you've got 2/3 of the people of Tasmania voting for a majority government...
It wasn't long ago that figure was about 90%.
Oh, of course, fully understood. And the challenge for the two major parties, is to restore the confidence within their base, etc., to get those votes back to them.
That is something that we have to go back and re-engage and build your trust and listen to what the community is saying, reflect them. The reason Jackie Lambie is she just agrees with whatever anyone says to her in the community. She sees an avenue for getting support, she'll push for that.
You know, democracy is about majority rule, right? That's what sometimes gets lost in this system, and when you have parties cobbling together arrangements which don't reflect majority, or fringe parties demanding more than... fringe parties in those arrangements demanding more than what is their fair share of influence. So I am very concerned about anything happening in that space. But
at this stage, it's going to be not a very stable government, I would say that.
If the Liberals do form government with the support of the Lambie network, I still see the possibility of us returning to the election within 2 years. And that's not good for Tasmania.
No one wants that. I doubt we'll be seeing that. So as much as I've enjoyed